Week 2 of the 2025 NFL season was insane. We saw some crazy games, brutal injuries, and some nuclear fantasy performances. There's a lot to dissect, and in this video, we will be discussing the biggest winners and losers from Week 2. Before we jump in, if you want this to be a weekly series here on Yam Talks, make sure to drop a like on this video. That tells me that these types of videos make you happy, which makes me happy. So starting on a positive note, let's talk about a group of winners, and that is the Detroit Lions offense. After week 1, people were already chattering about this Lions offense being washed and doomed without Ben Johnson, but they went stupid this week against the Browns on Sunday. The Lions boasted 2 top 12 fantasy wide receivers this week, with Amon-Ra St. Brown finishing as a wide receiver 1 with 39.2 PPR points, and Jameson Williams finishing as the wide receiver 12 with 18.8. On top of that, both their running backs, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, finished as top 24 fantasy backs, with Gibbs finishing as the number 8 back with nearly 20 points. Not to mention, Jared Goff finished as the quarterback 1 this week with a monstrous 34 points. All these insane totals clear any doubts of this Lions offense being washed. Lock them into your lineups heading into the rest of the season. So let's pivot to another offense and address the elephant in the room, and that is the Bengals offense, who no doubt end this week as big losers. Even though the Bengals won a close game this week and looked pretty good, they suffered a brutal blow with Joe Burrow slated to miss 3 months. That really just sucks as a football fan. I can't even imagine being a Bengals fan going through that. And the Bengals do this man dirty every single year. That deserves its own video. No doubt for fantasy, this lowers the ceiling for all Bengals players. We'll start with Ja'Marr Chase, who was the number 1 pick in most fantasy leagues. He takes a massive hit as potentially finishing as a wide receiver 1 without Burrow, which is unfortunate since we just caught a glimpse of that upside this week where he dropped 36.5 points. On the screen, you can see his stats with Browning when Burrow did miss some time in 2023. I don't think a top 10 wide receiver finisher still is not in play with Ja'Marr Chase for the rest of the season. But if the Bengals and Browning want to win games, they're going to need Ja'Marr, and Ja'Marr is capable of doing crazy things, as we know. So I still think he's going to see crazy volume, just not as much production that should come along with that volume, which we would have seen with Joe Burrow. T. Higgins' prospect as a top 14 finish also diminished to the realms of about a top 24 finish. If we're looking back at that 2023 season with Browning, when he started in place of an injured Joe Burrow, Higgins was finding more per-game fantasy success than Ja'Marr Chase. And then lastly, Chase Brown also takes a big hit as possibly being a league-winning running back now that this offense likely does see less scoring opportunities, but they also, on the contrary, are probably going to need to rely on him a little bit more to keep some of that pressure off Jake Browning, so he'll still be able to be trusted as a starting fantasy option. The last offensive unit we'll touch on is the New York Jets, who also land in the losers category. If you watched my videos this summer, you'd know I was fully fading the Jets offense for fantasy. Last week they made a fool of me, but this week they came back down to earth and realized my concerns with Justin Fields and this offense. Justin Fields had one of the worst quarterback performances in NFL history in week 2 before suffering a concussion in the 4th quarter. This in turn ruined the chances of elite players like Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall to have productive fantasy outings. They did go up against a top 3 team in the NFL, but the Ravens also found a lot of holes against that Bills defense in week 1 and were able to still find success. Another big week here for the Jets would have erased any of my preseason doubts with this offense, but it's hard not to be low on them once again after what we just saw. Sticking in New York, let's talk about some New York Giants. We'll touch on some winners first, and we had to talk about both wide receivers, Malik Nabers and Wan'Dale Robinson. Russell Wilson went off, passing for 450 yards, and who would have thought we'd be saying that at this stage of his career? But as a result of that, Nabers and Robinson had monster games. Nabers dropped 37.7 PPR points, making some crazy highlight catches, reminding us why he was a fantasy first-round pick. He's now the wide receiver 2 in all of fantasy, only behind Puka Nacua. If he's going to get quarterback play like this most weeks, he's going to finish as a top 5 fantasy receiver. Wan'Dale Robinson also enjoyed a big game, putting up 28.2 points on 8 receptions. He's clearly the wide receiver 2 on this offense behind Nabers, and based on what we've seen in the first 2 weeks, he is a solid waiver wire target in 12-plus man leagues if you've got the room. Another winner for the G-Men was rookie Cam Skattebo. He received 6 more carries than Tyrone Tracy in this one and was very efficient with those 6 carries. He also had a slightly more productive fantasy outing than Tyrone Tracy. Nothing is set in stone here, but this does bode well for the rest of his season outlook. On the contrary, Tyrone Tracy does land in the loser category due to the fact that he did lose significant work to Skattebo. If he isn't utilized as the primary back in New York, his fantasy value tanks on a bad team. And based on what we've seen through the first 2 weeks, I'm not confident he can be started next week and in the upcoming weeks. Next, we'll talk about 3 rookie running backs who all get the loser label this week. And we'll start with a guy I was honestly high on this offseason. That's Kaleb Johnson. I was confident we'd see him take over running back 1 responsibilities in Pittsburgh, considering he was a 3rd-round selection and had a great college resume. But he looks extremely raw, and Jaylen Warren looks like a do-it-all back for this team. Consequently, Kaleb is simply not getting work, and he's now the RB3 on the depth chart behind Kenneth Gainwell. I'm not giving up on him, but for the time being, he is a cut candidate for fantasy until we see him get real productive workload, which may not even be this season. Next up, we have TreVeyon Henderson. When we drafted him as a fantasy community in the top 5 rounds, it should have been common knowledge that this backfield would seek some kind of split and he wouldn't be the starting running back off the bat when you have a solid veteran like Ramondre Stevenson. But New England, what are we doing? You drafted this man in the 2nd round and you're only giving him 3 carries after all the promise we saw this summer and in preseason. When your running back room has 18 total carries in a game, TreVeyon Henderson should be seeing way more than 16% of the carries. His pass protection does not look great, but it still boggles my mind that he's not getting more touches on the football field. The only thing giving him any fantasy value through 2 weeks is the little bit of success he is finding as a receiving back. I would not panic and sell low here, but it just sucks to see this for a guy who was drafted to be a starter by many fantasy players. Finally, we have Dylan Sampson. Judkins was back this week, and he fully took over as the lead back in Cleveland. Can't say I didn't expect this, considering Judkins was drafted high in the 2nd round versus Sampson in the 4th. It's fair to assume that Judkins has a way higher ceiling here on out and Sampson's ceiling lower significantly, but I don't think he vanishes because both these guys were drafted to be a 1-2 punch, and it feels to me like the Browns just wanted to give Judkins a bunch of snaps this week to see what he looks like and give him some much needed NFL reps after missing all of preseason and I think all of training camp. While we had a trio of 3 loser rookie running backs this week, we also had a duo of winner rookie running backs. First off, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. He did not have a productive fantasy outing, but he does land on this list of winners because of Eckler's season-ending injury. JCM was already trending in the right direction after having a pretty hyped up offseason and having a great debut in week 1, but he's now locked in as a fantasy RB2 with high upside in this Commies offense as a starting back. The other winner is Bhayshul Tuten of the Jaguars. The trade of Tank Bigsby to the Eagles reduces a lot of uncertainty in this Jags backfield. It looks like ETN will be the number 1 guy, with Tuten playing a prominent supporting role. We saw Tuten put up a healthy 15.4 PPR points and being really involved in both the run and the passing game. He's a must-add waiver wire target this week if he's available in your league. Sticking with the Jags, a pair of week 2 losers are Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter. Starting with BTJ, through 2 weeks, it has to be frustrating to see him put up only 17.9 combined PPR points and not even cracking 10 points in a single game against 2 bottom-tier defenses in the NFL. You certainly expect more out of an early fantasy selection. I would not panic, and I'd continue to bet on the elite ceiling we did see last season with him. He is a prime buy low candidate if your league mates are panicking with him. Travis Hunter, on the other hand, he cannot be trusted in fantasy lineups moving forward this season unless he primarily lines up as a wide receiver. This week, we saw him take more of a responsibility as a corner, and that fully kills his fantasy value as a potential elite, consistent option at wide receiver. The uncertainty surrounding Hunter is exactly why he was one of my biggest fades this summer, and we're seeing that now. On the other hand, Jags wide receiver De'Ami Brown does garner consideration as a waiver wire add in deeper leagues and 3 wide receiver leagues after we saw him have a step up and just really have a good week this week. The entire Chiefs running back room lands in the loser category this week. Simply put, these guys do not look scary or dynamic at all. The lack of a productive run game is one of the reasons the Chiefs have found themselves as an 0-2 team to start the season. The leading rusher is literally Patrick Mahomes right now with 123 yards. The next closest guys are Kareem Hunt and Isaiah Pacheco, tied for 47 yards. The Chiefs running backs are unstartable for fantasy right now. If Pacheco is your RB2, it is time to start making changes. And let's flip over to a few running backs that were big winners this week, starting with Kenneth Walker. My subscribers know I'm not a canine believer for fantasy, but this week he did ball out. If you are a canine holder, it has to feel good to see him have a game like this where he drastically outperformed Charbonnet, who saw more carries. He can be put back into that RB2 conversation heading into next week versus New Orleans. In that same game, Jaylen Warren looked like a legitimate fantasy running back. We touched on him during Kaleb Johnson, but once again, he does look like a do-it-all running back for the Steelers team. He is a strong RB2 for fantasy. And then Achane impressed once again in week 2, finishing as the PPR RB3. This was expected. We know he's a beast, and the reason he lands as a winner this week is because the Dolphins offense looked competent this week. Achane will likely have a top 10 running back finish regardless of how this offense looks. But if we want him to finish as a top 5 running back this season, then this offense is going to have to generate scoring opportunities like they did this week. So this is good news for Achane. And then James Cook also had another stellar week. He's now the running back 1 in all of fantasy through the first 2 weeks. He looks like a man on a mission fueled by that big contract extension from a couple weeks ago. He can easily be locked in as an RB1 for the rest of the season. And speaking of back-to-back stellar weeks, Javonte Williams also feasted once again, positioning himself as the overall RB3 in the early stages of this season. Rookie Jaden Blue is inactive again in week 2. It's clear that Dallas trusts Javonte as their lead back. And while that's the case, he can be trusted by you to be a borderline RB1 in fantasy. So let's transition to some winner wide receivers now, starting with the Rams duo of Puka Nacua and Davante Adams. But Puka Nacua sits as the number 1 wide receiver in PPR through 2 weeks after a monster performance, again in week 2, putting up 27.6 points. He looks like a league winner so far into this season. Tay also had a monster game with 22.6 points on 106 receiving yards and a touchdown. In this game, he proved why he can be trusted as a fantasy wide receiver 2 as a second fiddle to Puka. Stafford being healthy really gives both these guys major boosts as fantasy starting options. Second-year wide receiver Odunze had a monster game, putting up 31.8 fantasy points. This game, in addition to a 17.5 week 1 outing, places him as the PPR wide receiver 4. I was expecting DJ Moore to have this sort of production under Ben Johnson this season, proving to be a fantasy steal. But so far, it looks like Odunze is the chosen one. All indications point to a breakout season for Odunze in both real life and in fantasy. Lastly, I can't continue to fade Keenan Allen. He has now had back-to-back weeks of fantasy starting wide receiver numbers, making him the wide receiver 12. It's clear that Herbert is moving different this season, and his connection with Allen is evident. Keenan Allen is very worthy of your flex position as long as this show keeps rolling. And a big loser at the wide receiver position is Nico Collins. Here's another guy like BTJ that people drafted early in drafts, and he's just been disappointing. To be fair, it's not really his fault. Stroud's struggles and the Texans' struggles as an offensive unit have carried over from last season. Nico now finds himself as a wide receiver 46, averaging just below 10 PPR points over 2 games. You can't bench him, but you gotta hope things turn around soon. Another week 2 loser who's simply not seeing action is Evan Engram. Engram was a preseason dark horse to finish as a top 5 fantasy tight end over there in Denver, but he currently finds himself as a fantasy non-factor and the tight end 39. It would be best to find other options at tight end if you drafted him as your tight end 1. And one of those tight ends should be Juwan Johnson, who is a winner this week for 2 weeks straight. He has been the biggest performer for the Saints in fantasy through 2 weeks, and he's also the tight end 2 in all of fantasy. I literally have been preaching his name all summer and every week. He's legit. They paid him $30 million this offseason. They're going to keep him involved. Make sure to follow me on X to catch my weekly starters like Juwan Johnson so you don't miss out. Another winning tight end is another guy who was preached on Yam Talks all summer, and that is Tucker Kraft. Tucker Kraft absolutely balled out Thursday night, having a career game and dropping 24.4 PPR points. Kraft led all Packers receivers in targets, and this game further solidified the trust that Jordan Love does have in him as one of his top targets. It's not crazy to say that Tucker Kraft could finish as a top 5, top 6 fantasy tight end this season based on what we've just seen through 2 weeks. Plus, Jaden Reed is now out with a broken collarbone, which should benefit Kraft and other players in this offense. And we're going to end with one final week 2 loser, and that is JJ McCarthy. JJ looked terrible in week 2 on Sunday Night Football after what was an electric fourth quarter performance and win in week 1. He's now ruled out next week with an injury, and it could be longer than that according to reports. I don't recall ever seeing him actually get hurt watching the game. I'm not sure if the team's using this as a reset period for their young quarterback. But before y'all start proclaiming he's a bust and all that crap, this is only his second game in the NFL. Let's wait and see how this plays out. For fantasy and the rest of the Vikings offense, it's going to be really interesting to see if this helps or hurts fantasy assets like Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson and the running backs with Carson Wentz. So that wraps up my biggest winners and losers from week 2. Make sure to follow Yam Talks on X for my weekly rankings, start, sit, DFS picks, and much more. And I'll catch y'all later. Good luck this week and peace.